6 weeks. That was how long the most advanced diagnostic equipment in the northeastern United States had been connected to a guard's red Porsche 911 GT3Rs, and that was how long it had produced the same answer. Nothing wrong, no fault codes, no sensor anomalies, no software flags, no irregularities in the engine management data, no irregularities in the fuel delivery mapping, no irregularities anywhere in the 47 separate diagnostic categories that the factory-certified system was designed to assess. Nothing wrong, except that every time Catherine Bryce took that car above 7,500 RPM on a straight road, the engine stuttered. Not dramatically, not with smoke or noise or the kind of visible distress that would have made the problem simple to locate. Just a hesitation, a fraction of a second where the engine lost its coherence and then found it again, like a singer hitting a note slightly flat and correcting before anyone could be certain they had heard it. Catherine had heard it. She had heard it the first time on the third lap of a private track day in Connecticut, and she had heard it every time since. And the fact that 6 weeks of factory-level consultation had produced a car that the computers said was perfect, and that she knew was not perfect had moved her. By the morning of the day this story reaches its turning point, past frustration and into something colder and more precise. She was standing in her private workshop on the ground floor of Bryce Performance Group's flagship location, looking at the car, when her lead mechanic Ray said the words that she had been dreading for a week. He said, "Catherine, the factory called this morning," she said. "And?" Ray said. "They've reviewed everything, all 6 weeks of data, every report we sent. They're saying the car is within specification. They're saying," Catherine said. "Say it," Ray said. "They're saying there's nothing more they can do." The workshop was quiet. 4 mechanics stood at various distances from the car, none of them looking directly at Catherine in the way of people who are physically present at a moment they would prefer not to be present at. Catherine looked at the car for a long time. Then she said, "Fine." She said it in a voice that communicated that nothing about this was fine. That fine was simply the word that preceded whatever came next. And that whatever came next was not going to involve accepting the answer she had just been given. Before I tell you who walked through that workshop door 40 minutes later, drop a comment right now. Tell me where in the world you are watching this from. Your city, your country, just that. I read every single one, and I want to know where this story reaches today. Because what happened in that workshop in the next hour is the kind of thing that people who were there do not describe as a repair. They describe it as a reckoning. Elias Ward learned about engines the way children learn languages. Not in a classroom, not from a textbook, by immersion, by repetition, by being present in the place where the language was spoken every single day, until it stopped being something he was learning and became something he simply knew. His father, Gerald Ward, ran a small engine and performance shop in Trenton, New Jersey, from 1984 until the year he died. The shop had 3 bays, a concrete floor that Gerald had painted red every 5 years for 30 years, so that the layers had built up to something that was less floor and more record, and a workbench along the back wall, where Gerald kept his tools in a red metal box that had belonged to his own father before him. The tools in that box were not modern. They were not proprietary. They were not calibrated to the specifications of any particular manufacturer's software ecosystem. They were the tools of a man who had learned, across decades of work on engines that ranged from lawnmowers to Le Mans replicas, that the most important instrument in a mechanic's arsenal was not electronic. It was attention. Gerald had said this to Elias so many times across so many Saturday mornings that it had stopped being advice and become something structural. The way a ceiling beam becomes structural, you stop seeing it, but everything depends on it. The car knows before the computer does. Listen first, look second, touch third. The computer is the last resort, not the first. Elias heard this at age 7 while handing his father a socket wrench. He heard it at 11 while helping rebuild a carburetor on a 1974 Jaguar E-Type that a client had brought in after 2 other shops gave up on it. He heard it at 15 while his father diagnosed an intermittent misfire on a BMW 635 CS by placing both palms flat on the valve cover and closing his eyes for 45 seconds. He heard it so many times that by the time he was 18, he had stopped hearing it as a sentence and started hearing it as a frequency. A way of being in front of a machine. He studied automotive engineering at a Technic at the college in Pennsylvania. He graduated with the highest marks in his program and a reputation among his instructors as the student who, when presented with a problem that the diagnostic equipment couldn't locate, found it by going back to what one instructor called first principles, and what Elias privately called his father's voice. He spent 10 years at a performance firm called Hargrove Technical in Princeton. High-end European vehicles, Porsches, Ferraris, Aston Martins, the occasional Pagani. The work that required not just training but instinct. The work that required understanding a machine not as a system of interconnected data points, but as a thing with a character that, if you paid enough attention, would tell you what was wrong before any sensor reported it. He was 32 when his daughter Nora was born. He was 34 when her mother left, not a villain in the story. A person who had wanted a different life than the one that had accumulated around her, which was he. Right, and which Elias had arrived at an honest acceptance of across 2 years of the particular quiet work that honest acceptance requires. He had Nora, he had his work, he had the red metal toolbox that Gerald had given him 3 months before Gerald died, pressing it into his hands in the hospital room with the specific directness of a man who did not have energy for ceremony and wanted the transfer made while it could still be made properly. Gerald said, "These are good tools, they don't need batteries." Elias had laughed. Gerald said, "I mean it. Everything you need is in there. The rest is already in you." He died 11 days later. Elias put the toolbox in the back of his truck, and it had not left the truck since. Not because he carried it for sentiment, though sentiment was present, and he did not pretend otherwise. Because his father had been right. They were good tools. They didn't need batteries. And in 9 years of carrying them, there had been more than a few occasions when that had mattered. The morning this story turns, Elias was in his kitchen at 6:45, making Nora's lunch. Nora was 8 years old and had inherited from her father the habit of paying attention to things other people overlooked, and from somewhere else entirely the habit of narrating those observations at full volume while her father was trying to make sandwiches. She was telling him about a bird she had seen in the yard the previous afternoon that she believed was a type of bird not normally found in their area and that she had looked up in a book and confirmed was not supposed to be there. Elias said, "How do you know it wasn't just a bird that got lost?" Nora said, "Because it was too comfortable. Lost birds look nervous. This one was just sitting there like it lived there." Elias looked at her. He said, "That's a good observation." She said, "I know." His phone rang at 7:12. He looked at the screen. The name was Ray Caldwell. He hadn't spoken to Ray in 14 months, since Hargrove Technical had been acquired by a larger group, and 11 positions had been eliminated, including Elias's, and Ray had survived the cut, and both of them had handled the awkwardness of that with the particular grace of two professionals who respected each other too much to let the circumstance damage the relationship. He answered. Ray said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to hear the whole thing before you answer." Elias said, "Go ahead." Ray told him about the car, 6 weeks, factory consultation, 47 diagnostic categories, the stuttering above 7,500 RPM. The factory's final answer that morning. Elias listened without interrupting. Ray said, "I know you don't work here. I know how it ended when Hargrove was acquired, and I know this is not a simple ask. But I have been standing in this workshop for 6 weeks watching people who are excellent at their jobs look at the wrong thing because the computer keeps telling them there's nothing to look at. And I keep thinking, NG about the BMW. The 635. Do you remember that?" Elias remembered it. A misfire that 3 shops had given up on. His father had fixed it in 40 minutes by listening. Elias said, "What does Catherine know about this call?" Ray was quiet for 1 second. He said, "Nothing yet," Elias said. Ray said, "I know, but if you come in and the car runs, she won't care how it happened. And if you can't fix it, then I apologize to both of you, and we're no worse off than we are right now." Elias looked across the kitchen at Nora, who was reading the back of the cereal box with the focused attention she brought to everything. He said, "I'll be there in 40 minutes. He hung up and told Nora he needed to drop her at school a little early today. She said, "Is it a car?" He said, "It's always a car," she said. "Can I come after school?" He said, "We'll see," she said. "That means yes." He picked up the red metal toolbox from its place by the back door. He put it in the truck. They drove to school in the early morning, ringing quiet, Nora watching the streets with her bird-noticing eyes, Elias thinking about a Porsche 911 GT3 RS that stuttered above 7,500 RPM and that the factory said was perfect. He already had a theory. He didn't say it out loud because theories spoken too early had a way of becoming assumptions, and assumptions were the enemy of listening. Catherine Bryce built Bryce Performance Group the way she built everything. Precisely, intentionally, without waiting for permission from people who had not yet understood what she was building. She had started with one used car lot at 31, inherited nothing, borrowed carefully, and made decisions about her business with the particular quality of focus that other people described as driven, and that Catherine experienced simply as clarity. She knew what she wanted the business to be. She built it toward that. If the road between those 2 points required more work than other people considered reasonable, that was a fact about the road, not a complaint about it. 3 locations now. Combined revenue above $50 million, a performance division that had earned a regional reputation for technical seriousness that Catherine wore as the achievement she considered it. Because it had not been easy to build, and nothing worth wearing was. She was not a mechanic. She had never claimed to be. What she was a person who understood quality at the level of someone who has spent 15 years making judgments about it every day, and who could tell the difference between a car that was performing correctly and one that was not without being able to explain in technical terms why the difference existed. The GT3 RS was her car in a way that went beyond ownership. She had specified every detail of the order. She had been present for the delivery. She drove it 4 times a week when the weather permitted, on specific roads she had identified over years of driving them, and on the private track where she had first heard the stutter. The car was an extension of the standard she held herself to, which was why the stutter was not just an inconvenience. It was an insult to the standard. She had been patient for 6 weeks because patience was the correct response to a problem being worked on diligently. She was no longer patient because the problem was no longer being worked on. It had been surrendered. Catherine Bryce did not accept surrender. She was standing in the workshop at 8:34, looking at the car and deciding what the next step was, when she heard the workshop's side door open and turned around. A man she did not recognize walked in. He was carrying a red metal toolbox. He was not dressed for the occasion, which in a workshop context meant he was dressed exactly right: clean dark work jacket, worn jeans, boots that had seen years of use. He was average height, lean, with the kind of hands that told you before anything else about him what his relationship with mechanical work was. Not rough hands in the waist, why of careless work, precise hands. Hands that had done a specific kind of labor for a long time. He looked at the car first, not at Catherine, not at Ray, who was standing near the lift with the expression of a man waiting for the weather to arrive. Not at the 3 mechanics who had gone still the moment the door opened. He looked at the car. He set the toolbox down beside the door with a care that communicated it was not being put down permanently, just set aside for the moment. He walked toward the GT3 RS slowly, eyes moving across the body, the wheel arches, the rear engine lid. Catherine said, "Who are you?" He stopped. He looked at her. He said his name, Elias Ward. Catherine looked at Ray. Ray said, "I called him. I should have told you first." "I'm telling you now," Catherine said. "This is my private workshop." Ray said. "I know," Catherine said. "You called someone without my authorization and brought them into my facility," Ray said. "Yes." The workshop was very quiet. Catherine looked at Ray for a long moment with the expression of a person cataloging a conversation they will return to. Then she looked at Elias. She said, "Who did you work for?" He said, "Hargrove Technical, 10 years. Before the acquisition, something shifted in her expression. "Not much. Enough," she said. "And before that?" He said. "My father's shop," she said. "Your father's shop?" He said. "Yes." She looked at the red metal toolbox by the door. She said, "You came here with that," he said. "I go everywhere with that." Catherine looked at the car. She looked at the 6 weeks of documentation stacked on the workbench, the printed diagnostic reports, the factory correspondence, the log of every test run and sensor replacement and software update. A stack 4 inches thick representing the complete record of a problem that the best available technology had failed to solve. She said, "The factory sent their senior technical team. Twice. Every fault code clean. Every sensor within specification. Every system performs. G within the manufacturer's parameters. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Elias said. "Yes," she said. "I'm telling you that the people who built this car, who know every system in it at the engineering level, looked at it for 6 weeks, and said there is nothing wrong with it. And you've been in this room for 40 seconds, Elias said. "I understand," she said. "Then explain to me what you're going to do that they couldn't," he said. "I'm going to listen to it." Catherine looked at him. He said, "I'd like to hear it run. Can someone start it?" Nobody moved for a moment. Then Ray looked at one of the mechanics, a young man named Cole, and nodded toward the car. Cole got in. The engine started. The GT3 RS's flat 6 filled the workshop with the particular sound that made people who understood what they were hearing understand immediately why this car had the reputation it had. High, mechanical, precise, with an urgency in its upper register that communicated more horsepower per liter than almost anything else wearing a license plate. Elias stood 6 feet from the car and did not move. He was not looking at it. His eyes were slightly unfocused, the way a person's eyes go when they are concentrating on something other than what they are seeing. He was listening. His head was tilted very slightly to the right. Cole looked at Ray. Ray shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Don't interrupt." Catherine stood at the edge of the workshop with her arms crossed and watched a man she had met 3 minutes ago stand in front of her car with his eyes half closed and his head tilted and make no movement at all. 20 seconds. 30. 45. 60. At 90 seconds, Elias said. "Rev it, slowly, to 5,000. Cole ran the engine up through the rev range. The sound changed character as it climbed, gaining urgency, the mechanical note tightening. Elias said, "Hold it there." Cole held it. Elias walked to the passenger side of the car. He crouched beside the rear quarter panel, near the engine intake. He put his ear close to the bodywork, not touching it, close to it, and held that position for 15 seconds. Then he stood up. He said, "It's not electronic," Catherine said. "Every diagnostic," he said. "I know what the diagnostics say. It's not electronic. The stutter above 7,500 is a mechanical fault. There's an air leak in the secondary intake resonance chamber, probably a fracture in the housing, or a failed clamp seal on the intake junction. It's small enough that it doesn't affect idle or normal running. Under full load, at the top of the rev range, the pressure differential across the intake increases enough that the leak disrupts the mixture. The engine management reads clean because nothing electronic has failed. The fault is in the hardware that nobody has physically inspected because the computer kept saying nothing was wrong." The workshop was silent except for the engine idling. Catherine said, "You got that from listening to it," Elias said. "And 40 years of my father's experience telling me that when the computer says nothing is wrong and the car says otherwise, stop looking at the computer." A long silence. Catherine said, "If you're right, how long to fix it?" Elias said. 5 minutes. She looked at him. He said it again, not louder, not with any performance in it. 5 minutes. Catherine looked at Ray. Ray said nothing. Catherine looked back at Elias. She said, "Fine." She said it in a particular way, not as an agreement, as a test, as the word a person uses when they are granting something they are fully prepared to see fail, so that the failure will have been authorized and documented, and they will not have to revisit this conversation again. She said, 5 minutes. Fix it. Elias walked to the toolbox by the door. He crouched in front of it and opened it. The interior of the toolbox was organized in the way that things are organized by a person who has used them for so long that the organization is no longer a decision but a memory. Each tool in its place. Each place worn to the shape of the tool that lived there. The red paint on the inside of the lid was chipped at the upper left corner where a ratchet had caught it in 1987, and Gerald had never gotten around to touching it up. Elias took out a flashlight, a mirror on a flexible extension arm, and an adjustable wrench that was older than most of the cars in the workshop, its jaw worn smooth from decades of use, its handle wrapped in tape that had been replaced twice and was due for a 3rd time. He carried the 3 items to the car. He asked Cole to kill the engine. The workshop went quiet. He opened the rear engine lid, not the full service access, the standard lid, the one you could open at a petrol station. He shone the flashlight into the engine bay with the particular deliberateness of a man who knows what he is looking for and is confirming rather than searching. The mirror on the extension arm went in next. Elias angled it fully, moving it in slow increments, checking a specific area of the secondary intake system that sat behind and below the main throttle body, tucked into a corner of the engine bay that was not easily accessible by direct vision and that required a mirror or a barescope to examine properly. He held the mirror in position and looked at the reflection. 11 seconds, he said. "There it is." Ray stepped forward. Catherine stepped forward. They both looked. The mirror showed a small plastic housing on the secondary air intake system, the resonance chamber, that smoothed airflow at specific RPM ranges, and at the upper lip of the housing's mounting clamp, a gap, not large, the width of a fingernail at its widest point. A gap that would be invisible on a visual inspection from above, and that would produce no electronic signal under any circumstances, because it was not a failure of any sensor or actuator or software system. It was a clamp that had loosened, a clamp that had been there since the car was built, that had been torqued to specification at the factory, that had loosened over time and heat cycles in the way that clamps on heat cycling components sometimes loosened. And that had never been checked, because the computers had never indicated a reason to check it. Catherine looked at the gap. Ray looked at Catherine. The three mechanics behind them looked at each other. Elias positioned the adjustable wrench on the clamp. He turned it. Once, the clamp moved. He turned it again. The gap closed. He removed the wrench. He removed the mirror. He closed the engine lid. He looked at Catherine and said, "Start it." Catherine looked at him for 1 full second. Then she looked at Cole. Cole got in the car. The engine started. Elias said, "Take it to 7,500. Cole ran the engine up, past 5,000. Past 6, past 7, past 7,500 and up toward 8, where the GT3 RS's flat 6 reached a register that was almost uncomfortable in an enclosed space, a mechanical scream with perfect coherence all the way to the top. No stutter, no hesitation, no fraction of a second loss of coherence that Catherine had heard on every run for 6 weeks. Just the engine, performing exactly as it was designed to perform, all the way through the rev range, clean from bottom to top. Cole held it at 8,000 for 3 seconds, then brought it back down. The engine settled to idle. The workshop was completely silent. Cole looked up from the driver's seat at Elias through the windshield, with an expression that was not quite professional. Ray stood with his arms at his sides, and looked at the floor for a moment, then looked at Elias with the specific expression of a man who had called in a favor, and been reminded of exactly why he had made the call. The three mechanics behind them said nothing. One of them, the youngest, a boy named Marcus, who had been with Bryce for 7 months, and who had spent 6 weeks watching specialists connect laptops to Thai's car, was staring at the adjustable wrench in Elias's hand with an expression that contained the particular quality of a person whose understanding of something has just been permanently rearranged. Catherine Bryce stood at the front of the car. She had not moved since Cole brought the engine back down. She was looking at the car, not at Elias, at the car, as if confirming for herself what she had just heard, which was the sound of a problem being absent that had been present for 6 weeks. The workshop remained quiet for a moment that was longer than moments usually are. Then Catherine looked at Elias. She said nothing for a second. Then she said, "How long did you know it was the clamp?" Elias said, "I had a theory from what Ray described on the phone. Intermittent fault, clean electronics, high rev only. That profile points to a mechanical air leak almost every time. The computer can't see air that isn't where the sensors are," she said. "You knew before you walked in," he said. "I suspect." "See, Ted, suspecting isn't the same as knowing. That's why I listened to it first," she said. "And if you'd been wrong?" he said. "Then I'd have been wrong and you'd be no worse off than you were an hour ago." Catherine looked at the wrench in his hand. She said, "That's your father's tool." It was not a question. She had seen the way he took it from the box. The specific care of a person handling something that carries more than its function. He said, "Yes," she said. "How old is it?" he said. "The wrench?" "About 40 years. The box is older," she said. "And you used it to fix something that the factory's own engineers couldn't find with 6 weeks of technology," he said. "The factory's engineers were looking for an electronic fault because their tools only show them electronic information. The fault wasn't electronic. The tool didn't matter. What mattered was starting with the right question." Catherine looked at him. She said, "What's the right question?" He said, "Not what does the data say. What does the CR saying?" What happened after that took longer than the repair. Catherine asked Elias to stay. Not immediately, and not easily, in the way that people who are accustomed to being the most capable person in a room do not easily ask for things. But she asked. They stood in the workshop for an hour after the mechanics had returned to their other work, and Ray had found reasons to be occupied in the service bay. And Catherine asked questions, and Elias answered them in the way he answered everything directly, completely, without performance. She asked about Hargrove. He told her about the acquisition and the layoffs, and the 18 months since. She asked about his father's shop. He told her about Gerald, about the red floor and the drafty window and the 3 bays, about the Saturday mornings, and the E-Type with the carburetor fault, and the BMW 635 with a misfire, and the 45 seconds of Gerald with his palms on the valve cover, and his eyes closed. She asked about Nora. He told him, ER. Single father, 8 years old, school 3 miles from his house, packed her own lunch since she was 6 because she decided she had opinions about sandwiches that were not being adequately represented. Catherine smiled at that, not the controlled professional smile of someone managing an interaction, an actual smile, brief and unguarded, that appeared and disappeared before she seemed to notice she'd produced it. She said, "I have a service division that costs me $800,000 a year to run, and that I am not entirely confident is operating at the level it should be." Elias said, "That's not a question," she said. "Number. It isn't," he said. "What's the question?" She looked at him. She said, "Would you be willing to come back tomorrow? Not for a repair. To walk through the division with me. Tell me what you see." Elias thought about this for a moment. He said, "I have to pick up my daughter at 3, she said. "I'll have you out by 2, he said. "What time in the morning?" she said. 7:30. He aid. "I'll be here at 7:15, she said. "Of course you will." He picked up the red metal toolbox from beside the door. He carried it to the truck. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about a phone call at 7:12 that morning, about a theory he had not said out loud because theories said too early became assumptions, and assumptions were the enemy of listening, about a clamp that had been loose for months, and that 6 weeks of technology had walked past without seeing. He thought about his father's hands on a valve cover, about the specific quality of stillness that Gerald brought to the first minute of any diagnosis, the stillness of someone who understood that the machine was already speaking, and that the only question was whether you were ready to stop talking long enough to hear it. The adjustable wrench was back in its place in the box. He had cleaned it with a rag before putting it away, the way Gerald had cleaned every tool before putting it away, because tools treated with care lasted, and tools that lasted were there when you needed them. He started the truck. He drove to school. Nora was waiting at the gate with her backpack on, and the expression of someone who had important information and had been holding it since lunch. She got in the truck and said, "Was it the car?" He said, "It was the car," she said. "Did you fix it?" He said. "Yes," she said. "With Grandpa's tools?" He said. "With Grandpa's wrench." She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the passing streets with the bird noticing attention she brought to everything. Then she said, "Grandpa would have liked that." Elias looked at the road. He said, "Yeah, he would have," she said. "What was wrong with it?" He said. "A clamp was loose. The air was going where it wasn't supposed to go," she said. "Why didn't the computer find it?" He said. "Because the computer was only looking at the things computers can see. The clamp doesn't talk to the computer. It just holds things together. When it stops holding things together, the car knows. The computer doesn't." Nora thought about this for the length of 2 traffic lights. She said, "It's like the bird," he said. "What do you mean?" she said. "The bird I saw in the yard. The book said it shouldn't be there, but it was there. The book was right about where birds usually go. The bird just didn't know about the book." Elias looked at her. He said, "That's exactly right." She seemed satisfied with this. They drove the rest of the way home in the particular quiet of a father and daughter who are comfortable enough with each other that the quiet is not empty. Elias went back the next morning at 7:15. He walked the service division with Catherine for 4 hours. He did not produce a report or a presentation or a document of any kind. He looked at the bays. He looked at the diagnostic workflow. He looked at where the technicians started on a problem, and what they reached for first, and what they did when. In the first thing they reached for came back clean. He asked questions, direct, specific questions that were not critical in their framing, but that contained within them, for anyone paying attention, a precise map of where the gaps were. Catherine paid attention. At 11:40 she said, "I want you here, in a defined role, leading the diagnostic process, building the protocol from the ground up." Elias said, "I work the way my father worked. I start mechanical. I go electronic when the mechanical doesn't answer. I don't carry a lot of technology," Catherine said. "I noticed," he said. "Some of your team will find that frustrating," she said. "Some of my team spent 6 weeks looking at a loose clamp and never found it. I think they'll adjust," he said. "I have a condition." She waited. He said, "I leave at 2:45 every day. My daughter gets out at 3, Catherine said. 2:45 every day, he said. "Without exception," she said. "Without exception," he said. Then yes, they shook hands. The handshake lasted the appropriate amount of time, and no longer, which was the way both of them preferred things. 3 weeks after that conversation, Ray found Elias in the workshop one morning before anyone else had arrived. Elias was standing beside a client's Ferrari, with the red metal toolbox open on the floor beside him and his father's adjustable wrench in his hand. Listening, Ray said, "You know you have access to the full diagnostic suite. The system we use costs $40,000, Elias said. "I know," Ray said. "You're using a 40-year-old wrench," Elias said. "I know," Ray said. "Is it better?" Elias thought about this for a moment. He said, "It's not better, it's different. The $40,000 system tells me everything the sensors know. The wrench tells me everything the sensors don't know. You need both, but most people only use one." Ray looked at the wrench. He said, "Which one do you start with?" Elias said. "Always the wrench." Ray was quiet. Elias crouched beside the Ferrari and put his ear close to the engine housing and listened. Ray stood and watched him and said nothing. The workshop was quiet enough that the morning traffic outside was audible. A compressor in the service bay cycled on and off. Somewhere in the facility, a door opened and closed. Elias straightened up after 90 seconds. He said, "Fuel pressure regulator, secondary circuit. It's mechanical, not electronic. We'll have it running by noon." Ray said. How Elias said, "Start the engine and listen." Catherine came down to the workshop at 8:30 that morning and saw the open toolbox and the wrench on the floor and Elias with his hands inside the Ferrari's engine bay. She stood at the edge of the bay for a moment. She thought about a guard's red Porsche 911 GT3 RS in 6 weeks and a factory's final answer. She thought about 90 seconds of a man standing still with his eyes half closed and his head tilted while everyone around him waited for something to happen. She thought about a clamp, about air going where it wasn't supposed to go, about a computer that couldn't see what a 40-year-old wrench and a lifetime of paying attention could find in under 5 minutes. She thought about her own 6 weeks of being certain that the problem required sophisticated tools and specialist knowledge, and that a man walking in with a metal box worn smooth from 40 years of use could not possibly have anything to offer that her facility's $40,000 diagnostic system had missed. She had been wrong, not about the sophisticated tools. They had their value, and she still believed in them. She had been wrong about what they could not replace. She turned and went back upstairs to her office. She had a meeting at 9 and work that needed doing before it, but she stopped at the top of the stairs and looked back down at the workshop floor, where the red metal toolbox sat open beside the Ferrari, and Elias Ward worked in the same stillness his father had worked in 3 decades before, in a shop in Trenton West, with a red concrete floor and a drafty window, and the particular belief that the most important instrument in a mechanic's arsenal was not electronic. It was attention, and attention, Gerald Ward had known, and his son now demonstrated every morning at 7:15, was not a technology. It was a decision, one you made before you reached for anything else, one you made by being still, one you made by listening to what was already there, already speaking, already telling you everything you needed to know. If you could only stop assuming you already knew it. The Ferrari would be running by noon. The wrench would go back in the box would go back in the truck, and in the morning, Elias Ward would take it out again. Because that was how his father had done it. And because some tools, the ones that had been used correctly for long enough, and for the right reasons, did not need to be improved. They simply needed to be used.